Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas.
And we post a video every Friday. So don't forget to subscribe and press the alert button so you can keep up with what we're doing.
Indeed. And if you have a burning horticultural question for Stephen Ryan, put it in the comments below and say where you're from in the world. And he, not I, will answer it in 60 seconds every Monday.
Yeah, I'll certainly do my best.
But Stephen, I'm smelling fragrant air and I'm feeling a little foreign. Where are we?
Well, we're in the country, but we're not in the country anywhere weird because we're just, 25 minutes away from my home in rural country Victoria at a friend's property. Ta-da! And the reason we're here is that this property will be a good backdrop for the things we're going to talk about today, which is in fact modern Spanish gardens.
So you went on a tour in European spring last year and visited many wonderful things without me, of course.
Yes, naturally.
But two of them were really incredible contemporary Spanish gardens.
Yes, and that's something that I found particularly interesting on this tour was in fact the way they're using their plants and the landscape and things to create a very Spanish look that actually translates really well to here.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why we're in Ruth and Barry's garden. Thank you, Ruth and Barry, for letting us be here, is because there are so many similarities with what you're about to see, with particularly southern Australia, that you could certainly emulate a lot of these things. But also a lot of what we're seeing can translate around the world because it's really about form and sculpture and use of plants.
And also using plants that are particularly adapted to the climate.
Yes.
Which is really important because this garden doesn't get watered.
And quite similar climatically, or perhaps it gets a little bit more water than the gardens we're going to look at. We're so teasing you because they are absolutely beautiful. So I think without any further ado, Stephen,
let's go to Spain.
Let's go to Spain.
Yes.
All right, Stephen, beneath the beautiful flowering pomegranate, where are we first?
All right, well, we're going to a garden near Toledo. It's a modern contemporary garden, but its roots are definitely well anchored in the Islamic gardens, and so it nods well to its history.
That's one of the things you'll notice as you see the footage, that we made a video about sort of classical Spanish gardens, and so many of those themes carry through into these modern designs.
They do. So they do nod to their history, but they generally have a modern sort of twist to it. So they're not sort of slavishly trying to reproduce that style of garden.
Now, just a quick overview climate. We're in southern Spain near Toledo. What's the climate, rainfall? How would you describe it?
All right, well, I would say it's very like parts of southern Australia. So it's very Mediterranean, obviously, it's close to there. So it has a hot, dry summer. They have crisp, coldish winters, so it can get quite cold there in the winter. They generally have rather impoverished soils, so it's very clay, gravelly sort of soils. And so the plant material they use has to be able to cope with sharp drainage, hot weather in the summer, cold weather in the winter, and most of these gardens aren't heavily irrigated, so the plant material has to be able to manage to a large extent on its own.
A lot like the garden we're in now. Well, without further ado, let's take a look at the first garden.
Yes.
So here we are. Here's the first garden.
Yes, and they've used a lot of low-growing shrubs, which they still trim, so that you've got that lovely sort of flowing effect. It's not trimmed as in hedging, but it's given a sort of a light, gentle trim over, and they're trying to cover the ground as much as possible. It keeps down maintenance, it keeps moisture in, and it keeps the roots cool. And there's common things like seaside daisies, the Erigerons are being used. So they're plants from all over the world, basically. But having said that, they are all Mediterranean style plants. So you've got a very formal water feature, and then we've got these beautiful trees. Look at how that pomegranate has been trained and cut and shaped.
Now, the pomegranate we're standing under is a double one.
Yes.
These are probably fruiting pomegranates.
Oh, yes, they'd be the classical pomegranate with their wonderful bright scarlety orange flowers and their beautiful big red fruit. And then amongst the shrubs, there's things like Teucrium, that lovely silver-leafed plant, which makes a great Mediterranean sort of ground-covering shrub, but it would get a lot bigger than that if it wasn't actually pruned.
And curiously, I mean, these pomegranates look not dissimilar to the way they'd be pruned in a Chinese garden to really emphasize the twist of the bark and the form.
Yeah, they're using oldish plants. I would say at a very reasonable guess that these are old pomegranates that were lifted from somewhere else and brought into this garden to then give it a sense of maturity and scale.
And aren't the flowers beautiful?
Oh, stunningly beautiful thing. I don't know why more people don't plant pomegranates. Even if you don't like the fruit, the plant itself is great because it has nice bark and trunks, wonderful flowers, attractive fruit, and generally speaking, very nice autumnal foliage before it sheds. So it does everything.
Lots of gravel. And I must say, I'm really loving the gravel as sort of like a neutral counterpoint.
Yeah, it's sort of a Tuscan gravel, one say.
But we're in Spain.
I know.
It's not Tuscan.
Yeah, but anyhow, it has that look of what we would call a Tuscan gravel here. And we don't have Tuscan gravel in Australia either because we're not near Tuscany. But all this shrubbery is all that sort of mosaic of different plant material, but planted in big sweeps of the one plant so that it's not patchy. It has this lovely sort of carpet effect.
So those pomegranates looked amazing. This one has the most sensational flowers. Oh, which I just pulled off.
Yeah, well, there you go. These things happen.
That won't fruit.
No.
So caring conditions for pomegranate.
Well, really, pomegranates love hot and dry. So if you've got a well-drained, hot, sunny aspect, you should be able to grow a pomegranate. Really, they're not that complicated. I mean, growing them like they were in that garden takes some finesse to get that look. I mean, this one's just growing as a freestanding bush. And of course, because it's the double-flowered one, which gets these fabulous sort of apricot orange flowers with the white tips to the petals, you don't get fruit off this because it's a sterile form. But the flowers are good and the autumn foliage will be fantastic. I have to say, though, I'd still plant the classical pomegranate for me. I like the fruit on them.
Where are they from originally?
Well, they're Mediterranean in origin. So, yeah. So, I mean, pomegranates show up in Greek mythology, Roman mythology. So they grow all the way around.
Of course, and in Turkey as well.
Yeah. So all the way around the Mediterranean basin, you'll find pomegranates growing. So there you go. So great plant for our climate.
Yes. One of the things that you see is eucalypts in that footage.
Yes, there's some beautiful big eucalypts in that footage. I think it's Eucalyptus, probably manigum, Eucalyptus viminalis. It looks like the right thing from the look of the trunks. And they work really well in Mediterranean climates because, of course, most of Australia works that way. But it is a two-edged sword because in some countries, eucalypts are becoming quite weedy. So I've seen them going feral in Peru. I've seen them going feral in Madagascar, South Africa, lots of different climates that are similar to our own. And of course, the other issue with eucalypts is that because they're quite resinous, they're also quite flammable. And so in some areas where there wasn't, generally speaking, a fire risk, where there was sort of retardant trees instead of ones that in fact combust, they're now becoming fire-prone areas. And so some of these big fires we're having around the world are basically about climate change, but they're also about the species that are being used. And if you avoid species that are highly resinous, like our Australian native eucalyptus, then you're probably less likely to create wildfires.
Now, beautiful as they are, what is the incredible one behind us in bloom right now? Covered in bees and butterflies.
Oh yes, it's a wonderful nectar source for creatures. So the bees are having the best time out. It's an Angophora, one of the used to be part of the Eucalyptus genus but is now separated out, and I'm not quite sure which Angophora it is, but it's certainly a magnificently flowering one and making a great feature in this garden.
It is. So Stephen, we're by another formal area because as the video progresses, you take us to this really beautiful, quite formal courtyard.
Yes, they do formal plantings quite well in these sorts of gardens, but they mix it with the informal, so it doesn't necessarily make a whole formal garden. But you can see that there's trees like fruit trees like quinces and things planted here. There's ground covers of fantastic junipers, which are very heat tolerant and dry tolerant. And then of course the structures like the pergolas and the ponds and things.
With an iceberg rose.
With the iceberg roses. I mean, they're all over the world. We might scoff at iceberg rose, as I often do. But having said that, it does do its job exceedingly well.
It does.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, the thing about this particular moment is it so echoes classic exotic gardens with that cross form, with the water, with the symmetry.
Exactly.
And also quite monochrome.
Oh yes, and most of it's in whites and greens. There's irises all the way around the outside of the pond. I'm not sure what colour they would be, but my gut feeling is they'll probably turn out to be white irises, unless there's something dark and purpley, just for the fun of it. And then of course they go into wonderful paving, and walls are beautifully structured and have a nice antique look even if they're not particularly antique. And so it's a very calming place to be. So there you go. And the iceberg roses work particularly well for that.
Ah, the fragrance of this lavender walk. I'm feeling very Mediterranean.
Yes, well, it's reminding me of lavender sachets in knicker drawers. But anyhow, it is a fabulous plant, and you can see that this is a bulk planting of lavender, and it's not trimmed like I saw in Spain, but it gives a sort of a feeling for the same idea, where you've got a big drift of something, all of the one variety, tying gardens together. And so, yeah, it sort of works that way.
And it's easier, isn't it? I mean, it's easier to source, easier to maintain.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be quite monotonous, but it kind of works.
Yeah, look, it's only monotonous if a whole garden is made up of the same sort of material. So when you're in a biggish garden, you need to do things with a broad stroke.
Yes.
And so in a garden of this size, or the size of the ones in Spain, then it would be foolhardy to try and have 55 different plants when you can have 55 of one variety of plant.
Indeed. And honestly, walking through here, the fragrance is heavenly.
It is gorgeous.
Once again, a perfect little spot in this garden with this amazing sort of blue-green agave.
Yes, Agave americana.
Which we can see in that amazing garden.
Yes, and I love the fact that you had something as bold as this huge, big South American, North American succulent.
Yeah.
Actually contrasting to the incredible softness and movement of the Mexican needlegrass or Mexican feathergrass, which unfortunately has also had a name change. So many of us would know it as Stipa tenuissima. It's actually Nassella tenuissima now, and also, unfortunately, it's considered to be a potential weed of national significance in Australia. And so, although it did sneak in for a short time, those in charge believe they've got on top of it, so we don't have it here in Australia anymore. And they're frightened that it will get out into the paddocks where there's cattle and sheep grazing. And apparently, if they eat that stuff, it has absolutely no nutrients, so they're full, but they're not being fed. So it could cause a lot of issues here in Australia if it took off. But we do, in fact, obviously there's always alternatives. So although I lust after Stipa tenuissima and would love to have it in my own garden, we do have some very attractive Australian native grasses that could do a very similar job. And I would actually opt for Stipa elegantissima, which may or may not have had a name change in recent times, which is the most wonderful, soft, cloudy Australian native grass. Definitely well worth growing if you're in a Mediterranean style climate. So look out for Stipa elegantissima if you want a really good soft grass.
And I think what I love is just that contrast. So you've got the gravel, you've got the sort of repetition of that single type of thing, the grass. And also grass is so soft, and you associate it, I mean, I know a lot of drought tolerant, but you associate grass with sort of moisture in meadows. With an agave, with the eucalyptus, it's a really beautiful contrast.
It is. I mean, there's a juxtaposition between the softness of the grass, the harshness of the agaves, the sculpturalness of the eucalyptus. I mean, the whole thing works exceedingly well.
It's a very well-considered garden.
It certainly is.
Roses, Stephen Ryan. Now, I like my roses kind of wild and overgrown.
Yes.
So here we are. It's very clipped. It's like a botanic garden, just rows of roses. With nothing else. I don't know. What do you think?
Look, I have to say it's not my favourite style of gardening either. I think if we're going to use roses in our gardens in this day and age, I think it's far better to try and opt for using them as a mixture amongst other plants, just like they are here at Rosebery Hill. They're just a component of the rest of the garden. But having said that, where you're trying to get those formal sort of Islamic lines and the formal sort of shapes into some of the garden areas within this garden, I guess those formal beds of roses sort of have a context, but yeah, they're not me, I have to say.
Yeah, not me either. I mean, I love a rose, but I don't like rose.
Yes, roses of rose. Yeah, in fact, I quite like roses as a cut flower, and that's where I think they're best. So I actually want my neighbours to grow them and give me bunches of them.
What was that other plant that you did the same?
Lilacs.
In our lilac video.
Yeah, so lilacs are 1 week wonders. Roses are leftover barbed wire in the winter. And so both groups of plants I love, but as cut flowers, and I'd much rather somebody else grow them and give them to me. So there you go.
You heard it here.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to get in my good books, bring me a nice bunch of roses, because nobody ever gives me flowers. Well, Matthew, now we're moving on to a second garden, which is a very contemporary modern garden, probably only a decade to a decade and a half old. Done by one of Spain's well-known landscape designers,
Miguel Urquillo.
Miguel Urquillo, and he actually showed us around the garden. So that meant that we learned quite a bit about what was going on. So the garden is very cutting edge. It's in an area which nobody else is gardening in. So it's very tough. No soil, no water, really hot and dry in the summer. It gets those hot winds that blow through off the sub-Saharan deserts from below the Mediterranean. And he actually said that he had no other garden that he knew of that he could use as a sort of, I don't know, benchmark on what he could grow, what would work. And so it was an extremely experimental garden.
And whereabouts are we?
Well, we're not terribly far away from Madrid at Avila, and it is a very rough sort of environment. So it's surrounded by harsh, rocky countryside with stunted small trees and a few herbs.
You're painting a beautiful picture, Stephen.
Well, and the owner of this property has built a magnificent home there, and he wanted it surrounded by a magnificent garden. So it's all about minimal variety of plant use, and in fact the rabbits and the climate knocked out a few species that didn't work terribly
Well, it sounds quite inhospitable, but amazing.
Yes, and it is. Why don't we go and have a look?
Let's. Well, this garden is amazing.
It's an incredible garden. I mean, the textures work really well together. When you look at the garden, you can see there's mounds of lavender, mounds of euphorbias, all sorts of other shrubs and plants involved, including one that you don't see in Australia very often, a thing called Phillyrea, and there's lots of it in this garden. There's only the two species that I'm aware of, Phillyrea angustifolia and latifolia, and it's a nondescript, fairly ordinary evergreen shrub, but when it's used en masse, and trimmed as it is in this garden, it looks fantastic, as do the cistuses. Of course, there's plenty of lavender in the garden as well. They've used the rock formations that are within the property, so they've allowed the natural rock to be exhibited, and yet they've then surrounded the garden by quite formalised stone walls, which I think are stunning.
They are. No, I love all that hard landscape design, and then the borrowed landscape over sort of on the other side of it, and you can see really quite how harsh it is. It looks like parts of inland Australia.
Yeah, yes, and so does my fingers.
Stephen's great camera work, never mind. But there is, so it's kind of wild, but it's also very controlled. So a lot of these things do seem to be clipped or pruned.
Oh yes, well you can see here as we walk down this little path, there's lots of trimmed and clipped Phillyreas and other shrubs, and it's all very informal along the edges. You can see it's well mulched, so that keeps the weeds down. But I understand there's basically a full-time gardener just trimming. And that's a hawthorn we're going past. And of course, even the pencil pines or Cupressus sempivirens are not left to go naturally vertical. They're even trimmed to be even more vertical. And there is the Phillyrea that I was talking about. Now, these are all the one species, Phillyrea angustifolia.
Because that's interesting. I was going to say, it kind of looks like a patchwork of different types of plant.
Yeah.
Sort of, what do you call that? It's not cloud pruning. What is it?
Well, it's mound pruning,
Mound pruning.
I guess. I just coined that term, but anyhow.
Look at that. I mean, it's so restful to the eye, isn't it? I mean, again, monochrome. There's barely a flower. The cistus are in bloom, and
there's a few euphorbias, but they're still green. And of course, I know when Miguel was first doing this landscape, there was going to be a lot more flowers involved, but most of the flowering plants that were put in either succumbed to the heat of summer or
like the rest of us.
Yes, or the deprivations of the rabbits.
Ooh.
So it has become probably a little bit more monochrome than it was originally designed to be, but I actually think that still works exceedingly well.
I do love the rock.
Oh, the natural rock and the rock walls and things around the outside of the garden are truly beautiful. And you can see there's sort of wings of rock sticking out around the house, making extra courtyard areas. So the bits are all cut off from each other.
And how big's the garden?
Look,
is it deceptive because of the way it's laid out?
I think it is a little bit deceptive. It's not huge, but at a guess, I'd say it covers an area of about 2 or 3 acres, but with the outside landscape sort of part of the
borrowed.
Yes, the borrowed landscape. And of course, the other thing that shows up in this garden, as it has done in the previous one, are the ornamental grasses, which have also become part of the look. And again, they've used that same Mexican feather grass, the Stipa tenuissima.
We can't speak of in Australia.
No, we're not allowed to have it here, but this imagery was taken somewhere else.
So in amongst all the lavender, these beautiful olive trees.
Yes, and
Ta-da!
yes, we happen to have found one here, which was planted by the current owner of this garden in Victoria by their grandfather. So it's 120 years old, thereabouts. So
Beautiful tree.
very nice old olive tree. And Miguel said when olive trees are used in gardens where you're taking a big one out of an olive grove and planting it into a made landscape, a lot of the ones that are being sold, they're being cut off, truncated. And so what they're really selling is a trunk with a root system. And then when the new shoots come out the top, of course, there's this sense of disbalance because you don't have the proper canopy.
Now, what's that called? It's not coppicing. When
Well,
you
it's
cut
more
the top.
pollarding.
Pollarding.
Yes,
that's right.
that's
So
right.
Pollarded,
Pollarded
olives.
Yes, pollarded olives. So what he tries to do is get olives where some of the structure of the old tree is still there,
Yeah.
so that when it's transplanted into one of his landscapes, it looks like a proper olive tree instead of a stump with some greenery on the top.
That's interesting because I've seen that, but I've never actually registered what the problem is. And you're right, it's just like a trunk with lots of new growth, whereas these are so beautiful.
Yeah, and of course it will take probably 50 to 100 years for those cut off olive trees to really put their canopies back again so that they look properly balanced.
Now, so this tree is a century old.
Yeah.
How easy is it to transplant olives? Because you often hear of it in, I guess, luxury gardening, people transplanting olives.
Oh, yeah.
So is it relatively easy as
It
a
is.
tree type to move?
They don't have an enormously big root system, so they're comparatively easy to shift.
Yeah.
If I was shifting one, I'd want to trench around it 1 year to encourage more fibre roots. So I'd dig down all the way around it and cut the roots and leave it standing.
Yeah.
Then you'd get more fibre root on it, and then I would lift it the following winter and move it to where I wanted to plant it. And I would do that with a lot of trees. In fact, it's a common practice to trench around trees. It's what they call wrenching. So you cut the root system and then that creates lots of fibre root and the tree itself will shift quite well. Of course, by taking the whole canopy off the tree, that also makes it easier to shift them because one, they're physically not as big, and secondly, they're not transpiring as much when they're shifted.
And when we were visiting Lyle at Rorama Nursery, he talked about moving a tree that was, what was it, 10 metres tall?
Yeah,
or
quite
14
large,
meters?
yeah.
And he basically cut the top off and it had a very small root ball. So he was just transporting a trunk.
Yeah, a trunk with a few roots on the bottom.
But that was a sort of tree that could rebranch. And
oh yeah, and olives will do that. But yeah, Miguel said it was more important to him to get the form of the tree transposed into the new site instead of a stump.
Well, I'm with him because that was stunning.
Yeah, I think so.
So here we are, a beautiful pond with frogs are croaking and water lilies.
Yes, exactly. And it's always a great feature in any garden. And of course, in the Islamic gardens, they were very formal bodies of water. And so these gardens often actually don't try to make a natural looking pond like this one behind us is. They do very formal canals and squared ponds and things. So it's a very classical way of doing it.
And it's interesting, we've said this before, but you just see that continuation of those design elements which are still being used in contemporary Spanish design now.
Yes, exactly. It's wonderful.
It is. This is a beautiful, bucolic little pond with lilies and frogs.
Yes, which I have a soft spot for, I have to say.
Oh, Stephen, I'm exhausted after our ramble through the gardens of Spain, the modern gardens of Spain.
It's exhausting, isn't it? Particularly from a distance. So here we are, back at Rosebery Hill and under one of the iconic trees of this garden, which just happens to tie in with the Spanish gardens.
And it is?
A cork oak.
A cork oak.
So, yeah, so Quercus suba, the cork oak. And this tree was planted by Ruth's grandfather about 120 years ago.
Who also planted the olive tree.
Yeah, who also planted the olive tree. So both Mediterranean trees, both ideal for the climate here. And this cork oak is certainly a magnificent specimen.
And so I guess sitting under this tree brings us to the point where all of those plants that we saw in both those gardens, really all of them you could use here. I mean, apart from the ones that are banned, but the idea of them in terms of their hardiness, their drought tolerance, etc.
Yeah, look, there's only one or two that you'd have to find alternatives for. There's one or two like the Phillyreas that are not really available here in Australia. I've tried growing them and selling them, but nobody seems to want them, so I haven't got them at the moment, although I've got access to propagating material if anybody's interested. They could put in a forward order, but there's plenty of alternatives. I mean, they're really just dark green shrubs that trim well, so you only have to find another dark green shrub that trims well.
That is so unpoetic. But I guess for anyone around the world wanting to replicate that, I mean, you kind of can, regardless of what your climate is. You could do it in a much colder, wetter climate. You could even do it in the tropics, I mean, except it's going to grow like billia.
Yes, yes. Trimming things is always an issue though, because it can be quite labour intensive. So although most of these gardens seem to be comparatively labour free with regards to weeding, watering and a lot of the other things that we see as normal garden jobs, that time is more than taken up by making sure that the plants are trimmed well. And I certainly know that the second garden had a gardener that basically spent his whole time trimming. So one garden staff member.
You can see that because, I mean, I don't like super trim things, and initially it just looks as though those shrubs have all found their natural rhythm, but in fact it's highly maintained, isn't it? I also love the simplicity and materiality. So there's just stone and gravel and the green material, the monochromatic. I mean, I love flowers, but I also just love seeing all those different greens.
It's funny though, when I went into these gardens, I got quite excited by them. Obviously you do, because they're fantastic landscapes. But one of the questions I asked myself, and the answer,
did you ask yourself,
I asked
Stephen?
myself,
What did the voice in your head say?
it said, would I like to live in one of these gardens? And as a plantsman and collector of plants,
no.
I have to say probably not. I enjoy visiting them, seeing them, how well they're done by other people, but in fact, I do like a much more complex and plant-driven style of gardening, but it doesn't mean I can't appreciate somebody else's efforts.
No, me too. I mean, I'd love to wander through it, but of course I wasn't invited.
You poor thing.
But if you want to wander through those gardens, what should people do, Stephen?
All right, well, if you were interested in doing the gardens of any of these places that I'm showing you, then go on to the website of Australians Studying Abroad. In fact, if you type in ASA Tours, it should come up.
We'll put the link below.
And have a look at the different tours that are on offer. The Spanish tour shows up pretty well every year, although I won't be leading it every time. And there will be tours all over the world, and they're not just gardening tours. There's architectural tours, art tours, all sorts of different tours on the company.
And you don't have to be Australian. All you have to do is get to the location.
Exactly, and you don't have to be studying necessarily either. So you can have a great time on these tours, as I always do.
And you do some every year, but different ones. So you don't always do the Spanish one or the French one. But where are you going this year, 2024?
All right, 2024, I'm doing Madeira and the Azores, which I'm so looking forward to.
And I am very jealous of.
Yes, and I'm also going to do a 12-day walk in Madeira to sort of acclimatise myself and get to know the place better before our group comes.
Lucky Stephen.
Yeah, so there you go. So Madeira and the Azores this year, France again the following year in 2025.
There you go. So we'll put the link below, and if you're interested, do have a look at the website and sign up.
Yes, please do. I'd love to take you on a tour, and then you could really learn what I'm like.
Oh, I tell you, that might be a bridge too far. Well, from beneath the spreading cork oak tree, if you want to know what we're doing next week, and it's not going to be in Spain.
No, you need to subscribe, press the alert button, and then you'll be told every week what's coming up. And if you've got a burning question, don't forget to put it in the comments below, and I'm very happy to answer them in our Monday shorts.
And remember to say where you're from. So until then, we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.